Welcome to Aderaba, Jewish Studies on the Contrary, a podcast about all things Jewish studies.
I'm Rafe Neis, and I'm here with my co-host, Gilah Kletenik.
Today, we're going to be talking about nature, the natural, and its converse, the unnatural, specifically the ways in which these ideas surface across the field of Jewish studies in ways both, how shall we say, promising and quite problematic.
Okay, how shall we say? Quite problematic.
How shall we?
I like that. I like that way of putting
Well,
it.
I don't want to have such a, spoiler alert. We're going to be critical. But I actually think a great place to start, Rafi, is talk to us a little bit about the way that nature looms or doesn't loom in the study of rabbinic text. I'm thinking specifically of the way in which, in your recent book, When a Human Gives Birth to a Raven, you make a really critical and valuable intervention by saying, let's take the rabbis seriously as people who study and consider nature. Tell us about that.
Okay, well, I'm somehow still stuck on the word loom. I'm thinking now about spinning and looming.
The rabbis also talk about spinning.
They do talk about
Can we do it on
looms.
Shabbos? No, we can't.
No looming on the Sabbath, right. So, yeah, I think that it is fair to bring my book into things. And I guess my book is partly an effort to address the history of the study of nature, which is a very weird field because it's often called science or history.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, it's a very interesting field. It's science or history of science, right? And it's this. So I think the first thing to say is really of course, I want to talk at some point about different meanings of the word nature and how the word nature has changed. The word natura or physis in Greek has changed over time and has become increasingly, I would say, since maybe since the early modern period, flattened and personified in ways that it wasn't necessarily in antiquity. So that's something I would really like to get to at some point in the episode. But to address your question, there's a modern European idea that the proper way, the only way to understand nature is through a discipline known as science, or a set of disciplines known as the sciences, and that the proper study of the history of nature is in some ways the history of science. And ancient Jewish sources have been excluded from that tradition. And the common trajectory is, surprise, surprise, ancient Greece through late ancient, say, Rome, and then you sort of get a split into medieval Christianity, but then you get the story of how Islam and the Arabs saved civilization, which means that medieval Muslim culture is seen simply as a tool for translating Aristotle and other Greco-Roman sources, which then get brought back to a place I like to call Europania.
And then they get repressed, by the way. But we can talk about that later.
And then they get rediscovered in the Renaissance, and then you have sort of the Enlightenment and so on, and then you have sciences, right? That's the
science.
Right. And so say a historian or a medical student will sometimes be taught about ancient medicine. Sometimes they'll go as far east as Babylonia or Egypt. There'll be a cursory nod. Yes, it's shocking. But basically, there's a very specific canon and a very specific set of ancestral sources, and the rabbis are excluded. And my point is to sort of say that that is a problem. It's a problem in the sense that it's anachronistic because people are using modern ideological ideas that are not neutral to say what the proper study of nature is. No, but we have to make the argument, not just because Gilah's looking horrified. So the point is that using those anachronistic ideas about what nature, how it looks when nature is studied, the rabbis don't do it. Or, as some scholars of Rabbinic say, it's subsumed to the one singular true quest, which is halakha, which is, as we've said, is very reductive. And sometimes because they need to know halakha, the rabbis talk about whatever this thing is called nature. And I say, not true.
Right. And I think it's actually fair to just have a side note that something that has surfaced in many of our conversations are the problematic ways in which rabbinic literature is slotted into a very specific genre, right? Both in terms of how it is viewed as people outside of Jewish studies historically, right? The rabbis don't do science, the rabbis don't do philosophy, the rabbis don't do these other things that are considered elevated, and yet people inside Jewish studies sometimes either reproduce those biases or straitjacket all of rabbinic literature, or usually really just the Talmud, into something very narrow like law. And you're coming along and saying this is all wrong, and we miss so much.
Right, we miss so much
when we don't actually just take these texts for what they're saying, right? If somebody's talking about a creature that exists, why can't we treat this like they're talking about science or nature?
Let's say, for example, in the tractate about slaughter of various animals, there's a lot of discussion about say bovine anatomy or various aspects of creaturely life, animal reproduction, and so on. And so you can say that because the tractate is about slaughter and ritually correct ways of slaughtering, because it's primarily about that, and the other stuff is secondary, which to me is you are imposing a certain priority on the text, and then you say, well, it's not really science, it's not Aristotle, right? And then sometimes what happens is, and this is something I actually found in my own researches, that the rabbis quote or paraphrase Aristotle.
Okay, tell us more.
That is often, so, when the rabbis talk about a pure creature can only come from a pure creature, a small creature can only come from a small creature, it is often read as a theory of purity law, but it's actually a direct paraphrase from when Aristotle in The Generation of Animals is sort of saying that even if it looks to the contrary, even if it looks like a sheep is giving birth to a camel, that camel-like creature is a sheep. So it's a theory about, in the context of Aristotle, it's a theory about the limits of reproduction and species variation. And the rabbis are taking that and adapting it, and they're including their own species definitions, which include pure and impure. For them, that's a species definition, pure and impure creatures. So somebody might say, well, the rabbis are doing science in as much as they quote Aristotle. And I'm glad to contribute to that version of counting. But I'm also saying that the rabbis don't have to quote Aristotle for them to be thinking about the creaturely world, how life comes into being, how you classify the variety of entities in the universe, and so on, right? That is a form of, and I'm going to say, quote unquote, science. And I want to be clear that when I use the term science, I'm not actually doing the thing that so often we do, which is to use modern rationalistic empiricist understandings of science and judge ancient sources by whether or not they conform with those standards. So according to that, if the rabbis say something like centaurs exist, then they were bad scientists, that's not science. No, I'm saying that ancient knowledge making may have included those kinds of realities for ancient people. I'm not judging the contents of their world, the way they world build, by modern rationalistic standards, right? So that's sort of part of it. That's where I think that sometimes people, and Gilah, you can say more about this, get Maimonidean on the rabbis. And so they'll say one of two things. They'll either say the rabbis were daft because they believed that there, for example, were creatures called field creatures or wild humans, adnei hasadeh, right? And of course that's not true. They must have confused orangutans with humans, right? So they basically make the rabbis dumb, to use an ableist term, and they correct the rabbis by the standards of empirical knowledge. Or they say that the rabbis weren't foolish, they were mistaken, which is another version of that, that they didn't mean what they said, is a third version. That's sort of like, Dibra b'lshon Adam. The rabbis they spoke in the language of the common folk, but they didn't really think that centaurs exist or that humans could have babies with whales or dolphins, right? And that's another way in which often scholars, rationalize pre-modern sources. that means that they have a very specific idea about what counts as nature and what counts as the correct way to talk about nature. And so that's sort of one of the things that I do in my book. But I thought, Gilah, that it might make sense.
Hold on, but before, I actually think it's important to just, in a sense, what you're saying is the rabbis are human beings who live in a world that is natural. And they are reflecting on its ideas. Sometimes they might be incorporating what they've learned, read, heard that would be called science, or at least what Aristotle might say about reality. But in a sense, you're also saying these are human beings who are part of nature. And so that surfaces in the way that they think about various things.
I'm saying a third thing as well. First of all, Aristotle is part of nature.
Well,
so
sure.
So everyone's part of nature. And that, Donna Haraway will call that nature culture, that there isn't this, that you cannot actually separate the way you talk about nature from the fact that you are itself part of it. It's not, there's no disinterested account of nature.
Yeah, but that wasn't Donna Haraway. No. That was Spinoza, but we can talk about
Sure,
Spinoza.
but Donna Haraway,
Just a few hundred years before.
Sure, it's not that it's not Donna Haraway, it's that she may not have originated that notion, but I don't know that Spinoza came up with this ugly neologism of nature culture. The point, though, I want to say that it's sort of, I'm saying also a third thing, which is the rabbis have their own way of discoursing about nature, and it should just as much be called science. And that, in a certain sense, the hierarchy that says this is science and this is, folk narrative, which is what some would say, or myth, or storytelling, right? That is itself a product of a very particular history in which Europeans and then Americans control what counts as knowledge. And that's why you have, for example, traditional, you have this idea of like native knowledge production, in which folks who've lived in the Americas for centuries and centuries have produced different forms of knowledge about the land, about the creatures that live on the land, which is delegitimized, or was delegitimized by European settlers, because for them these were not the sort of modern, sort of cultured ways of doing things. And so today you have these movements of epistemic justice that are trying to restore those native indigenous knowledge practices about the stewardship of the land and its creatures, that also have a lot of insight because they correct the anthropocentric ways in which so-called Western knowledge tends to work, right, to the detriment of the globe and other creatures beside the human. I guess what I want to say about nature is that there's just, this is maybe a reference to people who want to sort of read a really nicely a couple of articles that I think are quite approachable by the cultural theorist Raymond Williams. Raymond Williams talks about the multivalent ways in which nature is used. First, as the essential quality or character of something, so the nature, the essence of something. He talks about it, second, as a way of speaking about some kind of force that directs either the world or often humans, because humans like to talk about humans, or both. And sometimes an account of nature is to understand the way the world or humans move. And the third way of thinking about nature is the material world itself. And that can be taken as including or sometimes excluding humans. Sometimes nature is seen as the opposite of culture. Humans are associated with culture, and nature is outside. In some ways, the term nature began as a description of a quality or a process, and it later became an independent noun that was sort of seen as an abstract singular, like Mother Nature or nature with a capital N, so that there's some sort of essential uniform nature that can somehow, it's almost like the big theory of everything, like God, or it's some kind of abstract essential force, right? Some kind of, prime cause. And so Raymond Williams' point is that through the centuries, nature's complexity, it starts off as an account of complexity and it becomes more and more reductive. So, and that's eventually nature can be seen as something that you go to visit, that is not in the city, that there are special places that are natural, which of course are themselves constructed, but they're constructed as natural. And you have this binary between nature and culture. So those are just, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, the way the term nature is used.
Well, yeah, I think that's valuable. And one of the things that I think is often insufficiently discussed are the ways in which a particular Christian approach to so-called nature and being in this world has helped shape not just the understanding of science, but philosophy, and has reverberations, I would say, across the humanities today and also in science. So and this is something that I think Jewish philosophy, medieval Jewish philosophy, has a real resistance to, along with Islamic philosophy. I think the easiest way to look at this is to think about Augustine, who talks about a city of God and a city of men, who tells us that humans have a part of themselves that's nature, that's their body, but they have reason and will which transcends nature, and that's what makes them essentially human, most godlike, and therefore superior to all other beings. And there is really a through line that we have from Augustine, right? And until Descartes, who is the father, in a sense, of thinking about the new science. And for Descartes, the fact that human beings have a mind and a will that transcends their bodies, that makes them superior to other creatures and therefore leads them to become the masters and lords over nature. And that's what the scientific project is for him. Other creatures are mere automata. Human beings have a part of them that's nature, but the part that really matters is not of nature. And it transcends their bodies, and that's their free will and their agency. We then see this giving rise to all sorts of questions in philosophy today we could talk about another time, but the obsession with zombies or the prospect that we might be brains in a vat, all of this comes from a dualist tradition that traces itself back to Augustine and before that Plato. What I think is interesting is that medieval Islamic and Jewish philosophers have an alternative.
So how do medieval Jewish philosophers do it differently?
So, I mean, I think that there are different approaches, but one of the elements that is worth emphasizing is that for many medieval Islamic and Jewish philosophers, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, and in Jewish philosophy, I'm thinking about Maimonides in particular, but also Gersonides and others, human beings are not just of nature in a natural world, but the mind itself, thinking and reason, are always inside a corporeal body. Human beings are not exceptions to nature. They are one amongst many creatures. There's no escape from nature. And there's disagreements about how to read certain passages in the Guide of the Perplexed that seem to really diminish any sense of true kind of freedom or choice in the way that Christian thinkers, and beginning with Augustine, would imagine it. At the same time, Maimonides is indebted to certain Neoplatonic values. So there are plenty of passages that privilege reason over body, but for Maimonides, it is undebatable that a human mind, human thinking always exists inside a body. And this leads to a very different orientation when it comes to medieval Jewish and Islamic philosophy, which is always already political. It's always about, and that's why ethics looms large in medieval Islamic and Jewish philosophy in a way that's different from Christian philosophy, because it doesn't glorify an escape from nature. It doesn't glorify the part of human beings that are not in nature itself. And in fact, for Maimonides, the way that one gets closer to God is actually by studying nature. By studying the so-called natural world is the way that one can access God. One accesses God through understanding, according to Maimonides, the natural world that God has created.
Interesting. So an Aristotelian in that way too. I'm thinking about how Aristotle, on the one hand, the height of human being is a kind of melding with God through intellectual activity. And on the other hand, Aristotle is, spent a lot of time examining creatures and sort of literally documenting their physiology and sort of reproductive habits, right, in the history of animals and in the generation of animals. So you have that blend of intellection and groundedness and observation of the so-called natural world.
Right. And it's important to recognize that even the valorization of intellection in this tradition differs from certain Christian and also Jewish traditions as well, that view intellection as always transcendent to nature, as always not connected to something corporeal.
Mm-hmm. So I think going back to the Christian, if we can be, I'm sure there are more immanentist Christian traditions too, but if we want to also think about the ways that nature and the unnatural, we're not just thinking about the way, I guess I want to sort of rewind, that nature often comes with the term nature in the, not just in the contemporary world, but actually to some degree in the ancient world too, that there's an opposite to nature, that nature isn't just something that is an account of how things are and the ways they are moved, but that it's something that actually one should go, according to which one should proceed, and that's this idea of natural law. And the obverse is that if you don't follow the laws of nature, what you're doing is unnatural, and this is not moral. And you see that in Cicero, and you see it in Philo, this idea that there are laws of nature. And for Cicero, laws of nature are not necessarily law at all. And I think a lot of scholarship makes a mistake in thinking that just because there's the term law, that it's about law in the sort of state sense or modern sense, right? Cicero actually says very clearly that the laws of nature are not to be found as those laws enacted by the Senate or by the emperor or on inscriptions and in codes, but the laws of nature. And then he says a bunch of slightly contradictory things, that the right way to do things, what you should follow is like what good people do, the way that the world, how the world itself functions, and also the conscience of your heart. So there are a bunch of sources for natural law, but they're actually not found in anything like law itself. The reason I'm mentioning natural law is that it seems to surface in Jewish sources and certainly in Jewish studies. So Philo, for instance, describes the Torah as a version, like the best version of natural law, as that rare occasion. Unlike the laws of the Senate, the Torah actually does capture the logos of the world. Like it actually is, in a certain sense, it tells you exactly what you need to do to adhere to natural law. So it's just a special exception.
Well, and don't we see certain hints of, we have certain hints of that in rabbinic literature, the notion that God looked at the Torah and created the world. This
like the Torah's a blueprint of the cosmos is one of those. Yeah.
And yet in Maimonides, even if he might accept a certain notion of a natural law, one could argue as much, he does make it abundantly clear that the laws of the Torah are contextual, right? That many laws in the Torah exist and respond to the time and place in which the ancient Israelites were living, and they exist to correct mistaken opinions about the nature of God in particular, and also exist simply for political functioning.
That's
right?
Very different to Philo.
Yeah, it is very different, and for him, a lot of mitzvot generally accomplish one of those three things, which is much more social constructivist, even if God is the one who's commanding these. And the most famous example would be his disregard or the disdain with which he discusses the laws of sacrifices, which he says were essentially concession to the ancient Israelites to the time and place in which they were living, that it couldn't have been expected that they would immediately turn away from their idolatrous ways. And that's just, I would say, the most well-known example where he interprets a major pillar of the mitzvot, of the rituals described in the Torah, in a way that's very limiting and certainly very much not aligned with natural law and the notion that what the Torah commands is natural law and the way that things must be.
Yeah, and I guess I don't know kind of how Maimonides, I can't remember, how he thinks about deviation from natural law. Because one of the things I'm interested in is the ways that unnatural becomes a moral judgment, as if it's a bad thing. So that's sort of that. On the one hand, you have nature and culture, and you have nature as this negative bestial thing, in a way, in the Christian tradition, and both godliness and actually science are separate from it. So the scientist is actually separate from nature, not imbricated in the way that Haraway and Spinoza will say that the scientist is just as much part of nature. But on the other hand, nature is well, maybe it's the same hand. The nature is bestial, it's deviant. No, the unnatural. I'm sorry. The unnatural is deviant in some way. I'm sort of talking myself, and I was sort of confusing myself for a second. So on the one hand, we want to sort of separate ourselves in some traditions from nature, but in another sense, we want to adhere with in other traditions, we want to adhere with what's natural. And I'm thinking specifically in the realm of reproduction, and the idea of, Christian right ideas about what's natural in terms of gender and family and having children and stuff like that. And originally it was sodomites or homosexuals who are unnatural. Now it's trans people who are unnatural.
Right.
So how do we get there?
I mean, I think it's important just to state what's implicit in what you're saying, which is that the term nature or natural functions in ways that create social hierarchies and are marginalizing and exclusive, right? So we'll hear nowadays, as has been, it's unnatural, anything, sex between anyone who isn't a so-called man and a so-called woman is unnatural, right? Or we'll see it even, there's a natural way to reproduce and an unnatural way to reproduce. And so I think some of this goes back to the way that people interpret not just Hebrew scripture, but the way that we see early Christian thinking, like Augustine, and a certain natural way for him. The world, the universe, is naturally hierarchical. The same way that the mind is above the body, men, he thinks, are superior to women, the stronger are superior to the weaker, and so on. Much as he also thinks there's a very specific way to live and to be. What I think is more interesting are the thinkers who push against this. And Spinoza, you mentioned before, is a great example. For Spinoza, reality, all that exists is God or substance or nature, which means that if something exists, it is of nature and it's natural. And there's no escape from nature. He does not entertain any of these Augustinian or Cartesian dreams and fantasies, either of escaping reality, escaping nature, freeing ourselves from imbrication with others, or the downside, the kind of doubt that somebody like Descartes will, entertains. What if I don't exist? What if I don't know if anything else exists? And Spinoza, who's indebted to medieval, I would say, the sparks of immanence in medieval Jewish and Islamic philosophy, those questions don't make any sense to him, right? For Spinoza, human beings, like everything else, are embedded in nature, and there's nothing that isn't of nature or natural, right? So, for example, the dream I had last night, the food I ate this morning, a symphony that I heard last week, a book that I read today, the idea that I'm thinking right now, all of these are equally of nature, which means for Spinoza that they're all causally determined. For something to happen, there has to be a cause, and which produces an effect, oftentimes multiple effects. And that's a more naturalist stream of thinking about causation. And he does receive that from Islamic philosophy, which was actually banned in 1277, what they called radical Aristotelianism. And that was the church resisting the naturalism promulgated by Islamic thinkers, particularly Averroes, Ibn Rushd, right? This radical Aristotelianism were ways of seeing reality that resisted transcendence, thought that humans existed in nature, were of nature, and everything that happened had a cause.
So I'm trying to think about the ways that I'm thinking, these legislative or presidential enactments are both grounded in theologically inflected statements and scientistic, in the sense, when I say scientistic, I don't mean that it's scientific. I mean that it is the rhetoric of science to justify, so again, like the idea of cisness, right? Everyone is on the one hand, people are created in a particular way, but also we define gender according to biology, and then they choose, of course, a very particular way of defining gender, not acknowledging that biology is actually contested, that there isn't a single way to define a being, including human beings, as male or female. But there is this appeal to, I think, something like nature in reaching both for biology and for God. That sounds to me something close to nature with a capital N, that is both theological and supposedly also naturalist in some way.
Yeah. I mean, a lot has been written actually about the theological underpinnings of modern science. When it's being born in early modernity and thereafter, a lot of this thinking is coming out of medieval theological ideas, and those have just been transformed. So, for example, the notion of God as all-powerful morphs into the notion of human reason as all-powerful, right? Or humans as powerful over nature, which they're now studying in the Cartesian worldview. And I think that that it's a misnomer when people think that science is objective and that it is secular, when actually you study it, a lot of these ideas are coming right out of theological beliefs. So the kind of symbiosis that you're talking, so the symbiosis you're describing between the so-called scientist way of viewing things and what scripture says are actually go hand in hand. And it would have been anachronistic, certainly in medieval times, to separate them in the way that we might do today. Even as early modern scientists, and even modern scientists are inheriting their habits of thought and their frames of thinking.
Right. It was sort of what I was trying to say earlier, was that in a certain sense, the transcendent, right? I made the analogy between the idea of the transcendent being beyond nature and the account of nature coming from a scientist outside of nature, right? That's sort of what I was trying to get at. And I think that, I'm not sure that I fully agree with you, because I think that the kind of Protestant evangelical tradition that Trump is dog whistling to doesn't do theology in quite that way. It's more immanentist, actually. But I hear what you're saying. I guess I'm more interested in I would like to talk a little bit more about the deviant, the unnatural.
I think what's interesting is, and this is what's so dangerous for philosophies of immanence, right? When you jettison the notion that there's a specific way for anyone to be, then that just change. There is no metric by which you could say this is natural or this is unnatural, right? For Spinoza, if something exists and as it is natural. And so this binary between the natural and the unnatural, the artificial and the natural, makes absolutely no sense. Everything is equally of nature, which means that it was caused to be. And therefore there isn't any specific way that anyone should be. If they can be a certain way, then that's natural. What I find interesting is why do you think that's the argument that they revert to? It's unnatural.
I'm assuming that's a rhetorical question.
No, I'm asking you. Why do you think that that's a way of defending and stripping people of rights, to say that this is natural, this is unnatural?
I mean, I'm not sure that I'm actually really hearing that rhetoric so much. I think what I'm hearing it implicitly. What I'm hearing more is the invocation of a very particular reading of science and biology. I don't know that I've recently, in kind of public discourse, been hearing the kind of the unnatural being invoked.
I see. But when you say a specific way of reading nature, you mean looking at a body and saying this is what determines so-called sex?
For example, yes, exactly. A very selective kind of deployment of the rhetoric of science. So it's an appeal to nature, and implicitly it's saying if you don't conform to this, you are abusive, a deviant, or whatever it is they're trying to outlaw, right? Whether it's in the context of reproductive justice and abortion, which they're framing as a form of killing, or whether it's around same-sex stuff, or even around fairly explicit racist descriptions of people's aptitudes or certain parts of the world, right, being lesser, there's often this sort of appeal to nature and science to justify. And I guess maybe somewhat interesting to me is how much do we in the field, say, of Jewish studies or modern philosophy or ancient history, incorporate some of these ideas in? To what extent do we accidentally or on purpose incorporate these ideas into our own fields? And I know that, you and I and others have taken to task the ways that contemporary sociologists of American Jewry have used a combination of ideas drawn from science and demography to promote the family and reproduction. And you and I have written against that.
And leaning also on racialization and things that they've inherited from those discourses as well.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about the ways that certain kinds of continuity, the idea of Jewish continuity as a project of persuading mostly Jewish women to have more babies has enjoyed a feminist discrediting, right, as a problematic project. And you and I have discussed that in public, in writing before, as have other feminist scholars. So that's just one way in which you could argue that ideas about nature, both implicitly and explicitly, are being used to study Jews and to make policy recommendations about what Jews should do in the realm of epidemiology, right? Like this is sort of reproductive thinking. Yeah. Are there other things that we can think of, ways that I guess I can think of one example, which is maybe the way that the family has been used as an analytic unit to study Jews.
Even as it's important to recognize that the family throughout Jewish history was not what people imagine when they think about the neoliberal nuclear family. Right. So I do think that has been used, but I think that a lot of scholars recognize that what people think of and the nuclear family, it's hard to find. Right. You certainly, I don't see a nuclear family in Hebrew scripture. It's hard to see a nuclear family in rabbinic literature. If you look at medieval responsa, for example, there's often this recognition that people were part of families were not so nuclear at all. And there were often all sorts of different members of a household, exactly, much as we might see in rabbinic literature. And you have all sorts of responses about adopted children or people who joined the family. People were part of a household. And that's certainly, and I think that people who do real work recognize that there's no transhistorical notion of a family. But I think I do see some of that rhetoric in other ways, right? The choice to emphasize certain aspects in a thinker like Maimonides and in Jewish thinkers and de-emphasize other aspects. I think sometimes we'll see certain scholars reproduce what I would call Christian frames of thinking or habits of thought and retroject them onto certain Jewish thinkers in ways that either misrepresent them or at least emphasize only certain aspects of who they are. So, for example, there are people who would read the Guide of the Perplexed in a very Neoplatonic way and not at all focus on the ways in which Maimonides across his writings is and again, he's a physician, right, is focused on nature and the embeddedness of humans in so-called nature and being of nature, and would privilege certain, what I would call more obscure passages in the guide that would lead to a devaluation of the corporeal or the so-called natural. And I think those habits of thinking that go unquestioned might fall into the category which you're discussing. And the most famous is, of course, the dispute about whether or not Maimonides embraces resurrection after death. And there is a dispute about that. But I'm also reminded of certain work that I think is valuable, that sometimes work that focuses on uplifting marginalized voices. For example, thinkers or scholars who study women or women's experiences, be it like the midwives in early modern Europe or the so-called female or feminine maternal perspective in Jewish thought, I think sometimes without realizing it, they might be reproducing certain notions of a family, a transhistorical way of understanding a family, and often ways that I think could also be biologically essentialist. So maybe that answers your question?
Yeah, I think that those are some good examples. I guess what I'm wondering is it would be interesting to think about how Jewish studies, not maybe, in the same way that maybe scholars don't necessarily see the rabbis as doing science because they have very modern scientific ideas of what counts as that kind of knowledge. Those same people might at the same time import contemporary ideas about nature into sort of their analytic lenses. So family, gender, reproduction might be some of those examples. And I like the examples that you gave as well. The kind of dualism.
Yeah.
The objectivity tick is another example, perhaps.
And I would also say certain ways in which, and you see this more in Jewish thought, an interest in, freedom or free will and agency is a choice that they're making to emphasize certain sources in Jewish philosophy and de-emphasize others. And I view that as giving into Christian transcendence. Whereas somebody like Maimonides has a very deflated sense of free choice, if at all, in the guide, right? Where things are causally determined, there's a cause for every effect. And we could see a more immanent or materialist line of Jewish thought that goes from Maimonides to Gersonides to Spinoza to Karl Marx to Walter Benjamin, one could say, to Adorno and others, a materialist way of looking at reality. And I think sometimes those voices are not emphasized, and the Jewishness of those thinkers is not emphasized. Right. Marx would be a great example. He was a very close reader of Spinoza. Mm-hmm. And Spinoza's getting this immanence from medieval Islamic and Jewish philosophy.
Right. And it's also just, it's how you do, I think about how it obviously relates to your notion of the idea of a person or an individual as a fundamentally persuasive unit in the first place, which I'm not so sure holds exactly for the rabbis. And one thing that I sometimes find in my field is that people, it's not the case with all folks, but have a sense of a strong, modern, I think Cartesian understanding almost of the person as a captain, or even Platonic, the captain of their own ship, which I think that there is a somewhat more porous, intersubjective, materialist and embeddedly so understanding with the rabbis.
Absolutely. I think that relates to two other things, right? Which is the de-emphasis on a certain kind of radical individualism. Right. I cannot think of a single Jewish thinker who one could legitimately say embraces the notion of radical individualism. Like that is a Christian idea, or it is something articulated in early modern and modern Christian thinkers, arguably going all the way back to Augustine, who discovers free will. I cannot think of a single Jewish text that thinks about identity that way, that thinks about what we do and how we behave as free and imagines human beings as radical individuals who could be disaggregated from context, cultural, familial, societal, etc. The other thing I see is actually, and this is a great thing, the recent embrace of affect theory in Jewish thought. The recognition that feelings and emotions matter and are important. And I think some of that scholarship has been really important and de-emphasized the mistaken privileging of so-called reason versus, or in contrast to, emotions, when the truth is that for many of these thinkers, even Maimonides, the rationalist, for him the mind feels as much as the body, right? Feelings are not just the body ever and at all. And I think that would be valuable ways in which the scholarship has actually embraced alternative ways of thinking about nature.
I mean, some of this has actually come from this feminist perspective that I think in well-intentioned ways will sometimes appropriate the insult that elides the maternal with the natural and try to appropriate it toward a positive end to counter the kind of male, disembodied, rational reasoning figure. But the problem, of course, is when that leads to its own essentialism, which, maybe it doesn't have to. So, yeah, I feel like, maybe we're sort of getting to a place where we can start to sum up or reflect a little bit about some of the threads in this conversation. I think there's I feel like there's a lot of work to do. I can imagine a really fun conference on Jewishness or Jewish thought, from antiquity to the present about nature. And maybe we're
going to get someone in the comments saying, I organized such a conference 2 years ago. Yes, I was just going to say,
yeah, this is, and I know there is.
And we'll say, well, thanks for not inviting us.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I know that there are some, I think that I do know of a few sort of places here and there where there are people who are in philosophy thinking about this, sometimes in sort of thinking about ethics,
right?
Such issues. So it's not that it's absent, but I think that
it could be more critical, I would say.
Yeah, I think that what we're interested in is a critical understanding of not just nature, but in a certain way, knowledge making about nature, something that kind of critiques.
And I think your invitation in this conversation and to others, and something I want to take away from this conversation, is putting the mirror back on our field, right? What are the ways in which we implicitly perpetuate certain of these ideas and ways of thinking about nature across the fields of Jewish studies? And I invite our listeners to think about that. I think this is opening a conversation.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Gilah. I had an unnaturally good time.
Naturally.